Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition
that's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family.
Regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
welcome home.
welcome home.
I need a new mind. I need to set my prejudice aside. I need a new soul. I need a heartbreak. I need to see the tragedies abate. We are bound to one another. We can be human only together. Only together. I need a reform. I need a new mind. I need to set my prejudice aside. I need a new soul. I need a heartbreak. I need to see the tragedies abate. We are bound to one another. We can be human only together. Only together. We are bound to one another. We can be human only together. Only together. I need a reform. I need a reform. Let justice flow like a river, like a river. Righteousness like a stream, like a stream. Let justice flow like a river, like a river. Righteousness like a stream, like a stream. Let justice flow like a river, like a river. Righteousness like a stream, like a stream. We
Look up, love. Take your eyes off the ground. Show your face. A new day is here. The light is rising over you, shining brightly, moving shadows, touching your face. You are brilliant with it. Darkness may come and go, but the glory of our Creator is a constant companion, a steady light. Many will see you struggle to live. Your choice to stand up and walk in the light and be changed. Have the courage to truly see not only the problems, but the one who remains with you holding the light. We are all coming together. Family, neighbor, and exiles, taking our seats at the table. We are learning. We are healing. So, take the gift of this day you are given. Let the light enlighten you, emanate from within you, become you, be you. Power is shifting, and it won't look like what we think when love reigns. Cities riddled with the wreckage of war and marked by the scars of empire will exchange the sounds of violence and ruin for the clamor of co-creation and communion. Through the power of God, the oppressed and those stripped of their land are allowed to share in power. We all will weigh in. Life will grow from the most unexpected places. The smallest and least will be welcomed into the center, and their perspective will matter. Not only will violence cease, we won't want to hurt one another, but cooperate for the goodness of all. The whole nature of creation will change. The sun and moon will not be the light we revolve around. We will turn and grow by the light of God that shows us the illumined way to go. We will be ruled by the power of love. We will be remade and refastened to God and one another. We will learn what harmony means. Look up, love. Take your eyes off the ground. Show your face. A new day is here. The light is rising over you, shining brightly, moving shadows, touching your face. You are brilliant with it. Everything wrong side up is being upended. The table is extending, rounding. You have a place that is only yours. And everyone at this table will have more than enough. So, stand up, open up, take it all in, and shine.
There's a world at war, caught in suffering, silent casualties. God grant us peace. In these sleepless nights, I can hardly breathe, despite know that we'll be free. I know that we'll be free. So let the light in, keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love there's us to see. We'll all be free.
In these desperate times, love will hold us here. Love will join our hands, teach us to have no fear. So we'll lay our head down to wash their feet. When we see our sister, oh, we'll all be free. Oh, yes, we'll all be free.
So let the light in, keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love there's us to see. We'll all be free. So let the light in, keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love there's us to see. We'll all be free. We will all be free. Free, free. We'll all be free. We are free. 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 Free. We'll all be free. Let the light keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love there's us to see. We'll all be free. Let the light keep it shining. Let it break into the darkness. All the love there's us to see. We'll all be free. We will all be free. We will all be free. We will all be free.
Hello, friends. Glad to join you today. I have several announcements that you're going to want to know about. And as always, you can get all of this information at crosspoint.org or by subscribing to our weekly email list. First, this summer brings summer groups, and we have several summer groups to choose from. For anybody that wants to move into more of a connected form of participation with other people at Crosspointe, we've got groups centered on parenting. We have groups that discuss particular books. We even have groups that get together and discuss the Sunday message. That's not some Rotten Tomatoes sermon review group, so don't get any ideas about that one. We got a group led by a professor, many groups they're fantastic. They're all 6 weeks in duration. Some of them meet in person, some online, some both. Bottom line, if you're ready to get more connected with other people, you have options. Go to crosspoint.org/groups to sign up. Next, I'm excited to tell you that Story Night is back. Tuesday, June 21st, 7 p.m. at Fortnight Brewery in Cary. There's going to be live storytellers telling stories based on the theme, "Actually, I'm glad that happened." These stories that are told are true. They're personal to the storyteller. They're told without notes. I know many of you've been to a story night in the past and you know how great these evenings can be. Added bonus, our very own Claybrook will be performing some music live as well. So it's going to be great. It's a free event, but please register if you're coming. That way I can let Fortnight know how many people are coming, and then they can prepare themselves for that. Go to crosspoint.org/events/storynight to register. We also wanted to let you know that our Q&A session this past Wednesday with Jake Charles. Jake is the executive director of the Center for Firearms at Duke Law School. That was an incredible hour, an absolute information tanker regarding the Second Amendment, gun reform, what's realistic, what we can do. It was really great. if you missed it, or even if you saw it but you want to watch it again and would like to take more notes, you can find the recording and all the resources we mentioned at crosspoint.org/gathering. And finally, thank you to all of you who, of the many important ways to participate and sustain what we're doing together, those of you who fund what we're doing, from supporting the staff to making sure we have all the resources we need to the many people around the area that we are able to help with housing, rent and mortgages, car payments, groceries, utilities, medical bills, counseling, on and on and on. Thank you for being part of our collective ability to take meaningful, loving action every day of the week. If you'd like to start financially sustaining Crosspointe, go to crosspoint.org/contribute, and you're going to find many ways that you can do that. Or you can simply, even right now, text crosspointenc to 77977 and learn how to contribute via your smartphone. And all of these links for summer groups, story night, resources on gun reform, financially contributing to Crosspointe, all of those links can be found in the description below the video. And of course, you can simply go to crosspoint.org for more information. So, wherever you are, whoever you are, it's really good to be with you on this path and everything we get to do together. And it's really good to be together with you today. Have a great day.
Good morning, Crosspointe. I want you to think just for a minute about a time that you've experienced impatience. Are there things that make you impatient? Now, hold that in your mind for just a second, and we're going to come back to it. There's a story in the Gospels about a man who came to Jesus and asked him to save his daughter. And the story is told 3 times, once in the book of Matthew, once in the book of Luke, and once in the book of Mark, where we will take our text from today, Mark chapter 5. There's very little differences in the details of these stories as they're told in the different books. And as we walk through this story today, I do want to stop and take note that some of the foundations for my own thoughts come from a mingling of ideas that come from Dr. Will Gaffney and Dr. Paul David Jones. So Jesus, as he was recorded doing so many times, had been traveling the countryside with his disciples. He was teaching and performing miracles. He was healing people. And this would have been miraculous in any context, but it was even more so during a time where sickness and disease and mental health were not understood, where healthcare as we know it today didn't exist. In any context, to have health restored is a type of salvation. And people had begun to talk about this. Rumor had spread about this miracle worker, and people had begun to hear about Jesus. It's very hard to keep things like that quiet, even without TikTok and cameras at our fingertips. And so crowds gathered wherever Jesus went. Some of people came from long distances in hopes that Jesus would touch them or bless them, or that they might just catch a glimpse of him or hear him teach. And I'm sure there were hundreds of stories about Jesus, about his teachings, his interactions with people, that never made it into the books that we have today. But for some reason, this story was important enough to make it in 3 times. And the account goes like this, Mark chapter 5, verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, Jesus, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he, Jesus, went with him. Now, we're told a few things about this man, Jairus. He was a father of at least 1 daughter. He's a leader, religious leader at least, presumably well-respected. He's at the top of what we might call the social ladder. It's doubtful that he had often found himself at the feet of someone else, especially not in a begging position. And yet, like so many of us probably would have in his desperate situation, here he was on his hands and his knees begging for Jesus to come and touch his daughter and save her. And Jesus agreed to go. Now, timing was of the essence in saving the daughter's life. However, Jesus' popularity and the crowd around him was getting in the way of their forward progress. It was making their journey difficult and slow. And if any of you have ever been on the end of waiting for a loved one in the hospital, for emergency personnel to arrive for a diagnosis, you can imagine how Jairus must have been feeling, the anxiety taking hold of him, the urgency pushing him forward, and him urging Jesus to move, to walk faster. Things couldn't move quickly enough. And the text goes on. And a large crowd followed him, Jesus, and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She'd endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, much like Jairus, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Jairus' desperate journey was interrupted by a woman, and not just any woman. Whereas Jairus was at the top of his social ladder, this woman was at the very bottom. Whereas Jairus was not used to falling on his knees and begging for life, it seems that this woman was quite used to it. And as a woman, she did not have much in her power in her community. Her body also didn't function like most other women. She had been continually hemorrhaging, continually menstruating for 12 years. Her body had malfunctioned in a way that wasn't acceptable to talk about in polite company. Her private problems were often public ones. She was considered scandalous and unclean. And as a woman who continually bled, she could not fulfill the role her society had determined was most important for women, conceiving and bearing children. Religiously, ritually, she was not to be touched until she had stopped bleeding, had bathed, had been fully examined, and declared clean. She was not able to participate in regular society and community. This woman, we're told, had also spent everything she had to find a cure. Had she used her own funding to do this? Did she have a dowry she used? Had she been a woman of status at one time? We don't know. We only know that all the money she once had gone to physicians who were unable to cure her. And all these things left her a desperate woman, exhausted. She had tried it all with no success and decided on one more desperate measure. She no longer had anything to lose, and it moved her to do the one thing that so many of us spend our whole lives trying to avoid. She exposed her intimate and private life publicly. And in an incredible act of courage, she pushed her way through the crowd. She presented herself, her desperate, unclean, but whole and authentic self, to a stranger. The lowest of women didn't ask permission to interrupt Jesus' journey and touch him. She empowered herself. She broke in through the crowd, and it changed her life. What does it say to us that the most oppressed person in this story did not need to ask permission from the most powerful person in the story, Jesus, in order to seek to improve their situation? This isn't typically the way societies work. This story is about a man trying to save his daughter. It's also a story of the interrupting woman, but it's also the story about the importance of impatience. Remember that thing I asked you a few moments ago? What is it that has made you impatient? What makes you impatient? We've all likely heard the saying, patience is a virtue. And patience in the English dictionary is defined as the capacity to accept or tolerate delay, trouble, or suffering without getting angry or upset. You might have heard someone that's going through something difficult as having had the patience of Job, meaning that they're enduring more than their fair share of pain and heartache, with at least the appearance of acceptance. Depending on what translation you use, the idea of patience is mentioned somewhere in the Bible about 70 times. And the Apostle Paul famously says in Romans, "Be patient in your affliction." And there are times for patience. And there are also times for impatience. And I don't mean waiting too long for a pizza impatience or opening Christmas gifts early impatience. I don't even mean annoying people in our lives impatience. I mean the type of impatience that's seen within this bleeding woman. She exchanged 12 years of patience for impatience. We might call it righteous impatience. The woman practiced righteous impatience when she interrupted Jesus and Jairus' journey to actively insist that enough was enough. She was bold enough to interrupt, bold enough to not wait for permission, because she knew that if she didn't, things would likely remain the same. In fact, we might conclude that if this woman hadn't gotten impatient enough to interrupt Jesus, she might not have received healing at all. And too often we, particularly Christian people, use patience as an excuse for inaction. We do not act or interrupt or rock the boat claiming Christian patience when what we're really doing is procrastinating or delaying our involvement in making change. Impatience naturally comes with an element of critique. And while patience can sometimes lull us into acceptance and complacency, impatience has eyes to point out where change is needed. Impatience has the courage to stand up against the status quo and say, no more. Things cannot remain the way that they are. And while there is a time for patience, and it's a spiritual discipline worthy of cultivating, religious impatience is a path to liberation. There are times when patience must be exchanged for impatience in order to move the world closer to where it needs to be. And when those who claim to be seeking righteousness exchange patience for impatience, that's when things change and the world takes a step closer to looking like the kingdom of God. Not long after the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery in March 1965, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech that addressed the debate surrounding the Voting Rights Act. Now, this act was going to outlaw nationwide the racist and discriminatory voting practices that were being practiced in many states. This included things like literacy tests, poll taxes, a myriad of other things that directly hindered Black Americans from voting. Now, many white Christians were opposed to the Voting Rights Act. They called for patience, and they claimed that the legislation wasn't the path forward, that morality couldn't be legislated, but that eventually, with enough Christian patience, things would be made right once people turned to God. But Martin Luther King Jr. saw things differently. He saw firsthand a nation's history of slavery and abuse that, despite all the lip service, had not stopped abusing. Segregation had denied the most basic human rights for Black Americans and Americans of color. And he felt it was no longer time for patience, but it was time for active impatience. And when white Christians called on the leaders of the civil rights movement to have patience, MLK said, "It may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law can't make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. So while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. And when you change the habits of men, pretty soon the attitudes and the hearts will be changed. And so there is a need for strong legislation constantly to grapple with the problems we face." Martin Luther King Jr. practiced righteous impatience in his insistence on the continued fight for civil rights. And righteous impatience led through the civil rights movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act. Righteous impatience has also shown up in the fight by Jesus' followers for women's rights and in the pursuit of LGBTQ religious and societal equality. Righteous impatience leads people of faith in the footsteps of Christ. And I want to pause just for a moment and reaffirm that at Crosspointe, we believe all people have been created in the image of God, and that includes our LGBTQ siblings. And we want to say always, but especially during the month of Pride, that we reaffirm that you are welcome here and included here and welcome to be here. And we value your life and your perspective on God. And we will stand with you against legislation and policies that prohibit you from being able to express your beauty and your life. People of Christ have always stood with righteous impatience when it's a fight for change. And we know firsthand these past few years, and especially these past few weeks, with racial violence and senseless violence, that laws that silence the need for righteous impatience is never over. And of course, the impatient woman is not the end of the story. The woman made her way to Jesus, and like so many other people in the crowd were doing, she touched him. But almost as equally remarkable as the healing is that Jesus doesn't rebuke the woman for touching him. Socially, religiously, culturally, he had every right to. Instead, Jesus welcomed her into his own family. He called her daughter. This woman scandalized for her existence and her body and her embarrassing condition, was called daughter by God incarnate. God incarnate, who had been born from the body and blood of a woman. And perhaps Jesus looked into her eyes and he remembered his own mother. And this is one of the scandals of the gospel, the good news, that what society considered scandalous, Christ turned into sacrament. And to touch Jesus' clothes wasn't just to be healed, it was to be reborn. It was to be welcomed as family. It was to be resurrected. And let's not forget where this story started. Who was with Jesus watching this whole situation with the woman unfold, waiting, likely impatiently? Jairus. Remember Jairus, desperate for Jesus to heal his daughter, had just been interrupted by this woman. Someone who he would likely have never come in contact with or paid attention to on any other day. Someone whom society barely deserved to be alive. And definitely somebody who didn't warrant time and audience with Jesus. The text doesn't say this, but I can only imagine how I might have felt if the only man who I believed could save my daughter had been co-opted by a nobody. But for Jesus, this woman on the bottom of the social ladder deserved his attention as well, even though she had to interrupt to practice impatience in order to get it. And after the woman exited the story, Jairus and Jesus were interrupted again, this time by an impatient servant who had come to let them know that they were too late. They had taken too long. Jesus need not bother to come. Jairus' daughter had died. But Jairus, who had just heard Jesus say to the bleeding woman, "Your faith has made you well," heard Jesus say to him, "Do not be afraid, only have faith." And Jairus must have been haunted by the faith he had seen in the woman, the same faith Jesus challenged him to have as Jairus made the long walk to his home, with no more energy for small talk, expecting the worst when he arrived. And when the travelers were greeted at their home, it was by sounds of grieving and mourning by those who had lost someone they loved. And the text tells us this. When Jesus had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make commotion and weep? The child isn't dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and he went in where the child was. And he took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk. She was about 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. And this is presumably because the dead don't eat, only the living. Jairus was not disappointed. His daughter lived, as Jesus said to the girl, Talitha cum, get up. There's some interesting details that the writer gives us that we can miss in our celebration of the young girl's resurrection. Mark gives hints that underneath this miracle, this story is more than just about an impatient woman who had suffered for 12 years. It's more than just about the resurrection of a 12-year-old girl. Now, I'm not a big biblical numbers conspiracist, but the number 12 here is a direct connection to the Jewish people, their nation, their early beginnings as the 12 tribes of Israel. And the author's underlying message is not only to individual readers, but it's also a message to the Jewish people of that time. They lived under the heavy arm of occupation and oppression, and they needed a new vision of what the kingdom of God looked like. They'd been living with their old laws for so long. And just like the woman, it was time for the Jewish people, for Israel, to practice impatience, to interrupt things, both personally and corporately. It was time for them to be tired of the same old way of things. And just like Jairus' daughter, it was time for them to Talitha cum, to get up, to be resurrected. They needed to do what Jesus had said to the woman and to Jairus. They needed to put aside their fear and have faith enough and patience enough to be bold enough to move into action for change. They needed to be willing to allow something to die so that something new could be reborn. They needed to practice impatience in order to experience Talitha cum. Just like the woman and the girl, there are times when we need to practice impatience in order to live into Talitha cum. To listen to this command, to live into Talitha cum, is to live into resurrected space. To put impatience into practice, to continually be pushing against the powers that offer death and oppression, the powers that reduce people to objects, to push against the powers of isms and patriarchy and fear that perpetuate poverty and dehumanization, to push against the voices that tell us that we're not enough and that nothing will ever change and that push us to apathy and inaction. And instead, we need to practice the righteous impatience that allows us to rise up into a new sort of space. Impatience that is a resurrection space that claims the power of change and new things. Sometimes impatience is birthed out of anger. Sometimes it's birthed out of weariness. But impatience is always birthed out of the critique that things need to change. Righteous impatience today might look like anger and wariness at lives being taken by a culture of guns, at innocence being exploited by people in clerical robes. It might be anger at white supremacy and homophobia and transphobia masked as Christian values, at sexism and patriarchy and racism thinly disguised as family values. Righteous impatience says enough is enough. Enough of inaction and apathy masked as virtuous patience. Impatience pushes us closer to the way of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God lived through us is a yeast in bread that grows until it can't be ignored. It's a seed that takes over a garden. It's an interrupting, impatient woman who refuses to go back, but only forward towards something better. It's the 12-year-old girl who has been resurrected into something new. It's the call for a people to corporately be brave enough to put to death the old, to refuse to pick it back up again, and to move forward into something new. And this is what we're called to do as well. This is righteous impatience. Think again. What is it that makes you impatient? What brings you to righteous impatience? What's righteous impatience in our context today? I want to think about it broadly for a minute, and then I'm going to move it to a little more personal. Maybe corporate or broad impatience means that we move, like the bleeding woman, forward to make change, writing and calling our legislators about gun laws, racist practices, anti-LGBTQ bills. Maybe it means that enough is enough with a lack of affordable housing in our area. Maybe it means that we stand with others who are harnessing the power of impatience in these important issues. If that's you, I invite you to take a look at some tangible ways to do that on the back wall under the title Advocacy. More personally, maybe it's time to practice impatience in your own life. Are there things that it's time to say enough is enough about? Is it time to end or begin or repair a relationship? Is it time to make an appointment with a doctor or a counselor? Is it time to accept or resign from that job? Is it time to make time for self-care or to ask for help? Is it time for rest? What does this mean for me and for you? What does righteous impatience mean for us in our current context? Let's take just a minute and think about, in a new form, what makes us impatient, and let us have that cause us to move, to make change, and not be content to sit. Let righteous impatience move us to action. Have a good week, Crosspointe.
If you would like to know more or get connected to Crosspointe, go to crosspoint.org. If you're in need of care or assistance, go to crosspoint.org/care. And welcome home.